Welcome to Unequal India Decoded, a podcast from the Tax Justice Network, where we dissect economic inequalities in one of the most unequal countries in the world. I'm Raksha Kumar, and I've been working as a journalist for over 15 years now, reporting on issues of social and economic justice. In one of our earlier episodes, we did call out India's mainstream media's reporting on India's economic growth. But today, I feel like a fact checker, really. A few weeks ago, I heard this.
Now, in an achievement that few predicted a decade ago, India has climbed to the top ranks of the world's most income-equal countries. And that is not just a claim, it's backed by the latest World Bank data. Once often cited as a case study in inequality, India now ranks fourth globally in income equality, standing just behind the Slovak Republic, Slovenia, and Belarus.
Wait, hold on, what? I rolled my eyes when I heard it, and then I heard it again. And again, every major media platform carried the news.
India is now officially among the most income equal countries in the world. This is a very big deal. Let me explain why. So, according to a new World Bank report, India ranks fourth globally on income equality, with a Gini index of 25.5 in 2022, a dramatic improvement from 28.8 in 2011. For context, the Gini index is a way to measure income inequality.
Okay, so there was a World Bank report that said India was one of the most equal societies. Well, it took very little digging around to find out that that is not what the World Bank report said. It was the Indian government twisting the World Bank figures. When I worked in a newsroom, we rarely took government press releases at face value. Government press releases were considered to be top actresses with Botox and makeup wearing designer clothes. So stripping it of all the fluff is what gave us the news. But we live in a different world now. No sooner had the press release hit the Press Information Bureau's website than the mainstream TV channels and newspapers had absorbed it like a sponge and squeezed out every drop without question. Almost no one explained the reason for the faux pas. Well, here we are at Unequal India Decoded, pulling apart the World Bank data and busting the myth that India is the fourth most equal country in the world. So there were two false elements with the news. One, which claimed India was the fourth most equal country in the world. The news channels got this from the government, who claimed they got it from the World Bank. And second, the World Bank figure itself. With these figures, the government is creating a narrative, and this narrative is what determines policy. So if the government believes and makes you believe that India is actually more equal than it is, well, then it can forget policies like tax reforms that can bring about more equality. So it is very important for us to dissect this data and show how hollow it truly is. After all, inequality is evident when you just look out of your window, or when you compare the number of people buying luxury goods in malls to those buying goods from street markets, or when you see what a tenant farmer makes as compared to a large landowning farmer. So I spoke to Himanshu, who's a developmental economist and a professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, to help me understand this hullabaloo about India doing good on economic inequality. Himanshu, let's start with the World Bank data. Do explain that to us.
World Bank estimates in that sense have always been controversial or somewhat problematic simply because, see, they are aggregators. They don't create data on inequality by doing surveys in any countries. And by doing this aggregation, they are actually putting together a list of countries with whatever kind of data that is available from the domestic countries themselves. And in many cases, these are based on income surveys. In many cases, they're based in consumption surveys. And even within the consumption surveys, the definitions of consumption is not consistent across countries or even across years. That's something which has always been a problematic issue as far as comparison of inequality using the World Bank data itself is concerned. To be fair to the World Bank, they did not come out with this number that India is the fourth most equal country. It was basically an invention that was a reading of the data that came out from the Press Information Bureau of the Government of India. And the World Bank actually has been very cautious. And when they did put out a report on poverty and inequality in India, they did mention that the data on inequality is problematic. because it is based on the 22-23 consumption expenditure survey, which is not comparable with the previous years, and it has its own problems.
Right. So the World Bank said, let's not compare apples to oranges. The data for the latest survey was collected in a different manner than the previous surveys, so we cannot really compare accurately, it said. But in some senses, they do compare apples and oranges, right? For some countries, they use income data, for others, they use consumption data. Now, which one is more accurate to understand wealth inequality?
Remember, income data is a wider measure of income levels in that sense, because it includes not just your income which is consumed, but also income which is saved. But when you're looking at the consumption data, you're only looking at that part of the income which is consumed. You are not at all looking at the part of the income that is saved. And remember, majority of the saving is done by people in the upper half of the distribution, people who are, say, above 50% of the percentile levels. Majority of the people who are below that, bottom of the distribution, they just earn enough to consume. They don't have savings, otherwise they will not be poor. And so, therefore, any measure of consumption inequality is bound to be lower than a measure of inequality based on income, simply because savings are not accounted for in as far as consumption is concerned. And a large part of inequality arises from people at the upper end of the distribution who have surplus income and who they then save or put it in speculative activity or do for various other kind of things. So just because all the countries have consumption expenditure data and you put them together and then you say that India is the fourth most equal country, it doesn't make any sense, simply because the measure of consumption that we are looking at is itself very, very, very different across countries.
Let's now get to why this particular set of data was even more problematic. What happened this time, which was unprecedented and which should have given the media platforms a huge cause for concern?
This time, the World Bank actually did some adjustments on India's consumption data, which is what has led to the India's consumption inequality itself coming down very, very sharply to around 0.25, whereas actually it should be 0.29. So this 4 percentage point difference in the consumption inequality is entirely where the World Bank actually tried to experiment with the new measure of consumption for India. That was completely unnecessary and should not have been done.
Hold on. So you're saying the World Bank, which uses figures handed to them by individual countries, actually changed the figures the government of India handed them?
Absolutely. They should have accepted the data that the government of India had provided or released to the public at large. Let me give you the kind of changes and the three major changes that the World Bank has done. See, what they have done is that they have basically excluded the entire expenditure on durables. And they have also excluded the expenditure on hospitalization. They have also excluded the expenditure on what we call as semi-durable items, such as jewelry, watches, furniture, and those kind of things. And all of these items that I'm talking about, right from durables to furnitures to watches to jewelry or for hospitalization, are more likely to be consumed by the people at the higher end of the income distribution. So, because you remove that part of the expenditure, you are actually, in a sense, suppressing the or compressing the entire income distribution, and therefore like making it look like more equal than it actually is. Now, the World Bank's justification of not using durables is a very weird kind of a justification. And that justification is that they should actually be looking at the value of services derived from durables rather than the total purchase price of the commodities that have been purchased. For example, if you buy a fridge and then you pay, say, something like, say, 20,000 rupees to buy a fridge, they said that the 20,000 should not be included. Rather, what should be included is the yearly value of the utility that you derive from the fridge. And that basically could be that you assume that the fridge is going to last for 10 years, and therefore the annual value is going to be 2,000 rupees per year. Now, that's something which is a very weird kind of a justification for excluding. But since they didn't have the yearly value of the fridge, what they did was they excluded the entire expenditure on fridge.
This is such a great example of how data or figures or numbers are not always objective truths. Which number you choose to use and how you choose to use it determines the result you get. So we often forget this when we see data, right? We forget to ask about its context. But what is the other way the World Bank has changed the data, you think?
The second major change that they have done is they have basically adjusted the consumption expenditure of the poorer households by including the subsidies that the government gives. That is on food, on school uniforms, on footwear, on textbooks, and those kind of things. Now, the basic notion of income inequality also is inequality in private income and private consumption. The moment you start adding the expenditure made by the government to households, you are basically distorting the picture of inequality that would normally be available. Because this is about private inequality, this is about private consumption, this is about private income, this is not about what the government is spending. So they have added the expenditure that the government makes on food, on school subsidy, and various other things. And that itself is a problematic one, because how long, I mean if you are saying that since the consumer is getting utility out of this, I should be adding the expenditure that is made by the government on the UN, then you are basically opening up a Pandora's box. Because then everything that the government does, including building roads, or for example providing law and order, or providing free education, or for example providing free health, is a subsidy to the consumers. And therefore you can't go into that domain. That domain is completely out of bounds, and this has been a principle that the Indian government has followed, and most of the governments actually have been following. They do not include the expenditure of the government in private expenditure to basically artificially inflate your consumption expenditure or your income. And so by doing these two things, they actually come up with an adjustment, and that adjustment basically gives them a much lower level of inequality than would otherwise be available from the data itself.
The tweaking of the data makes me wonder who gains from this. And what would have happened if the mainstream media had caught this discrepancy? Clearly, the hardworking people of India do not care about equality numbers. If they're not getting an increase in their salaries, but they have to increase their spending month on month. In trying to digest all of this, I found myself going back to consumption data. So, if low income groups spend most of what they earn, but are paying the same amount of taxes everyone else is, how fair is that?
Income taxes or direct taxes are always progressive, in the sense the higher your income you pay a higher rate, compared to say any form of indirect tax, which is basically kind of a price based pro rata. So poor person will pay the same kind of GST on goods consumed than a richer person. So they are regressive by its nature, the way indirect taxes are designed, which is based on the product prices rather than based on your income level. So if I'm buying, say, for example, a bottle of water, and I'm the richest person and I'm the poorest person, we are in effect paying the same taxes. There has been some attempt, and that's why the GST regime was supposed to be. And many countries actually do that, is to have create kind of a bands where the higher priced items of the same commodity are taxed at a much higher level than, say, for example, the same commodity being consumed by the poorer households. I think the whole problem is not just the level of the indirect taxes, but how does the government look at the indirect taxes? The indirect taxes are seen as the government as the primary source of collecting revenue for all its expenditures. Whereas in most countries, if you look at it, they put an emphasis on direct taxes as the main source of generating revenue from for government expenditure. Now, we used to have this kind of a distorted picture, and unfortunately, that distorted picture of indirect taxes contributing roughly half of the total taxes, whereas the direct taxes being less than half, little less than half, is something still continuing. If you go to the most of the developed countries, you'll find that the direct taxes, and that includes income tax as well as the corporation tax, would actually be contributing roughly two-thirds of the total tax collection by the state government, by the governments. We are not putting that much effort. In fact, we have, while there is in talk about the tax reductions in the GST, what is not being talked about is that the government has given a much larger handout by reducing the income tax rates in the previous budget, which was presented in February. Yeah, but also, for example, in 2019, the government basically gave a subsidy of 2 lakh crores to the corporates, the richest corporates, and they are now paying an effective tax rate which is lower than an average tax rate for, say, for example, individuals and households. So it's actually the nature of indirect taxes, the way we treat progressive income taxes and corporation taxes, it itself talks about a larger political economy problem as to where the government is thinking of generating resources, using the taxation or fiscal means to bring about redistributive equality, redistribution for equality in the society.
Thank you so much, Himanshu, for the discussion. It has been very insightful. Do write to us at unequalindia at taxjustice.net and tell us if you read or heard the news that India was the fourth most equal country. How did that make you feel? Did it raise questions? Did it make you happy? Were you content? Let me know either way. Now it is time for our regular segment, the story of the rupee. In this segment, we try to draw a straight line from colonial practices in pre independent India to wealth inequalities in present day India. What were the connections? Turns out there were many. Today, we talk about monopolies, how they were formed, how they continued to be formed, and how they continue to exist. Professor Arun Kumar used to teach at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and joins me today to talk about the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, the main piece of legislation passed in 1969 to check monopolies in India. Professor Arun Kumar, do take us back to colonial times. Tell us where it all began.
When India attained independence, the country was very poor. There was hardly any industry, and the country that was decided by the leadership that the nation needs to modernize. And the modernization was to be along Western modernity lines. Gandhi was the only one who was talking about an Indian modernity. But the leadership of the Communist Party had decided that we need to go for Western modernity. And therefore, in 1944, there was the Thakur Das Committee that was set up by the Congress, which had all the top industrialists and businessmen of India as part of the committee. And this committee realized that India was grossly underdeveloped, its infrastructure was very poor, and the private sector did not have the capital to set up this big infrastructure that was required to modernize. So it was suggested in the Thakur Das Committee that we need to have a large public sector to support the private sector. So the idea was that both public sector and private sector would coexist in India and they would mutually help each other. It was also the case that during the colonial rule, there was a lot of drain of wealth from India. So the savings and investment rate was very low. Now it is from 1950 onwards that the savings investment rate also started going up because the drain of wealth which was taking place to Britain, that stopped and the savings and investment rate started rising. So when we attained independence, we started going in for big dams, big factories, and so on, production of steel, making roads and making ports, and also investment in education and health so that we could modernize. Now, as a result of all this, there's a need for optimum utilization of resources because you could not waste resources. You had very few resources. So therefore, the idea was to do central planning so that we do not waste resources. This was copied from the Soviet Union.
And when did we realize that the general consensus was broken? You know, the consensus that India can afford to modernize along Western lines with the help of the private sector?
So we come to the 60s, and where we find that this crony capitalism that has been going on and this suppression of consumption that was going on was leading to illegality and black income generation. People had to wait in lines. So there was a dissatisfaction in the middle classes and the upper classes. And therefore, the consensus that had been arrived before independence that we would have a public sector and a private sector and we would have some kind of planning consensus broke. And what we find is that monopolies were growing, and that's why the government was called Tata Birla Ki Sarkar, which meant that the government was catering to the big business only. The debate in parliament also took place where it was mentioned that poverty is not getting reduced. The trickle down is not taking place from the advanced sector to the backward sector. And therefore, this planning and these so called socialistic policies, they're not delivering as far as the common man is concerned. And that is what led to the idea that how to prevent monopolies from forming in the Indian economy, because they would corner resources. And monopolies also meant that these monopoly houses had undue share of political power, because they could influence politicians policies in their favor. So not only economically but also politically and socially, this creation of monopolies was not something which is desirable. So Zari committee was set up, which looked into this monopolistic practices and the restrictive trade practices that were being followed by big business in India.
So, what you're saying is that after the British left and the wealth drained from India was significantly reduced, it began benefiting big businesses. So, big businesses advised the government to keep competition out so that they could benefit from the Indian market, and in due course, they began becoming monopolistic powers. What did the Hazari Committee find actually?
This Hazari committee found the various ways in which these big monopoly houses were misusing licenses and how they were trying to camouflage also their growth. For this, they found that there was an umbrella pattern of holdings. So there'd be no one individual or one company which would have a large share of the holding of a company, but a number of companies. And these companies, therefore, had an umbrella pattern, as it was called. So there was a manipulation of licensing, manipulation of the companies, and so on. So the Hazari committee suggested that we need to have an act and prevent forming. And that's why in 69, the MRTP Act, the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, was implemented in India so as to prevent the monopolies from forming and the various economic and political ill effects that were following from that could be kept in check.
That's an early example of moving capital to tax havens to obscure ownership and avoid regulations. So clearly, until the end of the 1960s, when the MRTP Act was passed, independent India had undergone many economic crises. The path the country chose to grow economically didn't seem to please anyone.
So in the 1950s, we had the balance of payment problem, because of which we had to restrict imports. Then in the 60s, we had the agriculture crisis, the food crisis, and because of that, we had to stop the planning process. Also in 1967, 68, 69, there were three planned holidays. So in other words, the policy package that was being implemented from the time of independence, that started unraveling in the 60s. You also find that the Naxalite movement took place. The Naxalite movement started in 1967, where the poor people in East India, they revolted because the trickle down was not taking place and their situation was not improving. So, in other words, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the planning process and with the public sector and so on, because it was not delivering to the poor. So on the one hand, the businessmen were unhappy. They didn't have the freedom to do what they exactly wanted. On the other hand, the common citizen also felt dissatisfied that after a lot of time which has elapsed after independence, they are not getting much of the benefit, and the benefit is being cornered by some people. And in this process, the black income generation process continued.
So you're saying there was a parallel economy where money was being accumulated by some people without really declaring it. So it's kind of like a black market for goods that we know. And who was driving this? Who was driving this black income generation?
Clearly, the black income generation was driven by these big business houses, because they were making extra gains. And part of that extra gain they were taking out of the country through flight of capital. So, in other words, a poor country was also exporting capital. So, on the one hand, there was shortage of capital. On the other hand, capital was being exported by these businessmen and the corrupt people in the political class and the bureaucracy and so on. So, what the British were doing was taking capital out of the country to their home country. But after that, now the money was going to these tax havens.
All of this must have had a huge impact on the economic growth of the country. I'm not suggesting that growth figures are all we need to focus on, but they do give us an indication, especially when India chose to develop the way the Western economies did, correct?
So, what you find is that in the 50s, the rate of growth of the economy suddenly sharply went up. 1901 to 1950, growth was averaging about 0.7% or thereabouts. But from 1950 to 1965, the rate of growth jumped to an average about 4%. The sharpest jump in growth rate took place in that period in India because the resources were being invested with. But then again, from the mid 60s onward, resources were flowing out through the flight of capital and other such problems that were being created, the crisis in agriculture, and the rate of growth dipped again. And it did not recover till the 70s, the mid 70s. Then did it recover back to what it was in the 1950s and early 60s.
Yeah, the 3.5 to 4% rate of growth came to be known famously as the Hindu rate of growth. It was used as a pejorative at a time when the East Asian economies were seeing massive growth rates and the West was growing fast itself. I have so many problems with the term, the fact that it equates India to a Hindu country, the fact that it brings in religion into economics at all. But that's a discussion for another day. So let's go back to the attempts at restricting monopolies in India. Can you explain how big businesses circumvented laws? What was the umbrella pattern of holdings you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, so umbrella pattern has two components. One is that these business houses, the big business houses, were entering almost all the areas coming up for production, right? But then they were using that to show that in no particular industry did they have a big share. But through its different companies, it was having small, maybe 5% here, 3% there, 8% there. But when you added up all the different companies investing in a particular company, it became a big this thing. So that's how the monopolies were getting created. But using the umbrella pattern of holding, it was being hidden so that it doesn't become apparent that one company is holding everything.
Got it. So let's now do a report card on the MRTP Act. How successful was it in reality?
The idea was to prevent monopolies from forming, but that was actually not possible because the monopolies had already formed. So, how do you demonopolize? How do you sort of break them up? And because these big houses were very powerful, therefore, none of the monopolies got broken up. And then also, what happened was that in 1974, you had the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, FERA, which was for the multinational companies. They had to also dilute their holding because their holding was very large. So, in a sense, you had the MRTP and then you had the FERA. And then simultaneously, you also had small scale reservation because it was felt that these smaller entities in the production process, they will be labor intensive and they needed to be promoted so that employment generation could take place. The big companies, they actually quite automated and mechanized, and they did not offer that much employment. So from employment point of view, the small scale reservation was very important. And the FERA was so that the holding of foreign companies would be diluted and Indian public holding would also be there. Now, the MRTP Act was saying that we should not have restricted trade practices because using restrictive trade practices, you could earn a higher profit so that the profitability would be impacted. And also that these mergers and acquisitions that could take place, creating big entities, that also had to be restricted. So the idea was to prevent monopolies from becoming bigger. But I think the idea was not to actually disband the monopolies and break them up. So the monopolies continued into the 70s and into the 80s. And through the licensing process, capitalism continued. So therefore, the MRTP Act was not being very effective.
In many ways, the MRTP Act died a natural death, did it not? We have spoken about India's failed attempts at forming monopolies until the 70s. Do tell me a bit about the 80s and how it almost became inevitable that big businesses would corner large parts of the economy.
The economy was slowly opening up in the 80s. And because of that, the Indian industry had to compete with the outside companies, which were much bigger in size. So, in a sense, I think Indian leadership allowed these monopolies to continue because otherwise they would not be able to compete with what was outside. But then what was happening was that the Indian market was being protected through high tariffs. So India had high tariffs so that foreign goods could not flood into India and impact these Indian production. So the MRTP Act was not very effective in controlling either the monopolies or the restrictive practices that were being followed in the Indian market.
And what about post liberalization? India opened up its markets to the world economy in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union officially collapsed. And cronyism kind of increased in many ways. Um, you didn't have licenses, but you needed proximity to power.
So people talk about post 1991 cronism, but you see, cronism had always existed. But post 2014, what has happened is cronism has become much more narrow. Earlier, the cronism was that even many other big business actually could influence policymakers and could get their work done. But post 2014, it has become very narrow. It is only two, three big business houses that are getting a lot of this industries and so on and so forth. So it be Adani's or Ambani's or Tata's, but even say like the Birlas, take this Ultratech cement company, which is the largest cement company in the country. They were going to acquire from Holcim the two companies that Holcim wanted to sell and move out of India. These are very profitable, ACC and Ambuja Cement. At the last minute, that agreement between Ultratech and Holcim was broken, and these companies were allotted to Adani's. Allotted in the sense that the agreement was broken and then Adani's entered the picture and they got these companies. Similarly, in many other cases, it is found that certain big business houses, they're getting all the airports, the ports, and various other things. And this can only happen if there's a cronism which is favoring them. The AI center that is being set up in Vishakhapatnam with a $15 billion investment over the coming 5 years, that is an agreement between Google and Adani's. Now, Adanis don't really have any specific expertise in this setup of AI and so on, but it's gone there. Similarly, in the case of defense, for instance, companies which have no expertise in defense production, they were favored. So, all this is pointing to a much larger sense of cronism that has come in. And I think the thinking behind this, from what I hear from the ruling party circles, is that Indian companies need to be at a global scale. So therefore they have to become, some of the companies have to become very big to be able to compete with the big MNCs and so on. But unfortunately, while these companies are being acquired, these companies are growing, they're becoming huge monopolies, the real problem is technology. Your size is not what matters, it is whether you're technologically dynamic or not. Are you developing technology? That's what gives you dynamism. So if we look at, say, South Korean companies, or the Chaebols, or we look at Japanese companies, they became big and they also developed technology. They could be dynamic technologically in the global markets. So in the global markets, it's not just the size that matters; it is also whether you have advanced equipment which others are willing to buy. Unfortunately, in India, cronyism is there, but it is not leading to technological development by these big companies, by these big conglomerates that are getting set up.
So we tried to restrict monopolies time and again. But in the 80-year history of independent India, we have not just failed, but failed spectacularly at doing so. Moreover, Professor Arun Kumar just explained how monopolies and cronyism might just be increasing. That's all we have for you in today's episode. But do write to us at unequalindia@taxjustice.net and tell us your thoughts on monopolies in India. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast or any podcast application you use, or through our website, podcast.taxjustice.net. There are links in the show notes that give you more context to everything we've spoken about today. You've been listening to Unequal India Decoded from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Raksha Kumar, and we'll be back next month. Thank you for listening in.